Some critics of school vouchers like to point to history. They say the school choice movement evolved from efforts to fight integration of public schools. Our next guest is here to correct the record. Phillip Magness is visiting assistant professor of economics at Berry College. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So this really is something that you hear sometimes from people who oppose vouchers or school choice in general, that, wait a minute, you look back to the 50s and 60s, and this all started from people who wanted to fight the ruling in Brown versus Board of Education. Are they correct?
Right. So the issue is much more complicated than that. Vouchers do emerge simultaneously with an upheaval in the school system that takes place in the 50s and 60s, and integration is part of that. But there are also religious movements that are trying to seek alternatives to public education. But the big story here is the free market side, and that's Milton Friedman, who is kind of the father of the modern voucher movement. So he writes an article in 1955 that sketches out the theory behind vouchers, why competition in schools work. And there's actually a footnote in the article that's often overlooked by people who make this argument, and Friedman is explicit that he is an integrationist. He's a supporter of integrating the schools, and he actually sees vouchers as a means to undermine and defeat and work around segregation. And he even goes on record and says if the choice were only between forced segregation, which is basically the status quo that they had, and using government tools to mandate integration, he would be unequivocally in the latter category. But he sees vouchers as a better mechanism to bring that about.
So basically, Friedman in his article stand entirely against this narrative that we've heard about the history of school choice.
Yeah.
Does he go on in that article to explain why he thinks vouchers would work better?
Right. So both in that article and then some of his later work, particularly his book Capitalism and Freedom, which comes out in the early 1960s, he develops an argument, says that if you allow competition to occur between schools, you'll basically enter into a marketplace for education. And he draws on the work of one of his students, Gary Becker's, another future Nobel laureate. Gary Becker puts forth an economic model of why discrimination happens. And he basically says in the long run, discrimination is a very economically unprofitable mechanism. It's a tool that self-excludes part of your customer base from it. So Friedman's idea is that if you introduce choice into the education system, over time, integration will win out over segregation because it opens up a broader market share to students, to potential people that are competing to draw students into their schools. And then you add on top of that, you can make a moral case. Moral suasion, Friedman says, is one of the great tools that we have to bring about integration. So he sees this as complementary to the voucher movement.
This sounds as if it's one of these cases that we've seen in other areas of our economy where free markets can help drive better results than government policy, even when the government policy is directed specifically toward integration, markets can work better to achieve the same goal.
Yeah, and that's a big component of Friedman's argument. Says the notion of choice brings people over to the right side of the issue, rather than using the force of a mandate. So he's trying to not only solve the problem of segregation, but bring the populace on board, and he sees markets as a better mechanism to do that.
That is the voice of Phillip Magness. He is visiting assistant professor of economics at Berry College. Now, what you're talking about is so different than the narrative we hear from some of the critics. Why is this not better known?
Well, part of it is just a deficit in archival research. I've been digging into this issue pretty heavily for the past year or so. And one of the discoveries I made came out of Charlottesville, Virginia in 1959. There's actually an anti-voucher coalition that emerges around some members of the school board in Charlottesville, and the anti-voucher coalition teams up with the segregationists because they believe that vouchers are going to undermine this institution they're trying to maintain, desperately clinging to after the Brown decision. And the whole idea was that the courts had prohibited the local school board from forcibly segregating their school system. So that's off the table now. But they wanted to use backdoor segregation, which they did it through two mechanisms. You geographically zone the white and black students to different schools. And then to prevent them from crossing over into different zones, you have a very rigorous cap on enrollment that they'd enforce at the white schools. And there's a local attorney in Charlottesville by the name of John S. Battle Jr. He's the son of a former governor, one of the main litigants against the NAACP in all these integration suits. And Battle says, wait a minute, if these vouchers pass, if they come into existence, some white students will leave the schools facing integration, but that opens up seats that black students could take. So he sees vouchers as kind of this threat to the system they're desperately trying to cling on to. So Battle's argument actually takes hold a little bit later in the story, because Virginia does adopt a rudimentary tuition grant system in 1959, and they have to do it on race-neutral terms, even though there are some mixed motives that come in from segregation. But the big story that happens there is after the system comes into play, they start seeing who's using the vouchers. And it's not white students fleeing integrating schools. It's students of all colors that are seeking better schools, seeking an improved school system, whether public or private. So when they start doing statistical analysis of it, they find that most people that are using this voucher system are not using it for segregationist purposes. So this upsets the teachers union, which is still segregated at the time. And you've got as late as 1964, the Virginia Educators Association is taking a stance in favor of putting segregationist strictures on the voucher program because they think it's taking their money away.
As you present this information to people who believe the other narrative, the narrative that it's the segregationists who wanted the vouchers, are people surprised?
There is a bit of incredulity almost, because this narrative becomes so ingrained on the other side. But the evidence is fairly overwhelming when you start seeing it printed in the teachers union journals, their in-house journals and letters. There are statements to the press where they are siding in favor of segregationist strictures on the voucher system. So it's hard to work around that from an evidentiary front. Now, it is still a complicated story. Segregation is only one of many different components that's going into what is playing out in terms of voucher politics. But I view my role as kind of bringing that complexity to the story that's missed by this very simplified political narrative.
In the brief time that we have left, once people hear this real story, do you think that will help boost support for this notion of vouchers as a way to help improve education overall?
Yeah, I think it brings some more evidence to bear that's also consistent with the empirical results of what we're seeing from rudimentary voucher systems in action, and they do tend to break down barriers. So of the statistical studies that have been done of voucher systems performance, and also alternative schools, charter schools, you find that de facto segregation that previously existed just by where people live breaks down when you start introducing choice into that equation.